People like to believe that calm men are born that way. That some people simply arrive in the world less reactive, less emotional, less affected. It's a comforting idea. Because if stillness is genetic, then no one is responsible for earning it. But Charles Bronson wasn't born unmoved. He was trained into it. Not by mentors. Not by philosophy. Not by choice. By environments that punished reaction. And rewarded restraint. Long before anyone knew his face. Before a camera ever followed his movement. Before his name meant anything at all. Bronson learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. Movement costs energy. Emotion costs focus. And focus is the first thing you lose when survival is on the line. He learned this underground. In places where light didn't reach. And noise traveled faster than reason. Coal mines don't allow panic. They don't negotiate with fear. They don't care how young you are. Or how tired you feel. They respond only to mistakes. Bronson entered that world early. Too early. And once you learn to function in spaces where mistakes are final, you don't forget it. You don't grow out of it. You carry it forward. When war came, it didn't introduce chaos into his life. It confirmed it. In the air, surrounded by thin metal and thinner margins. He learned the same lesson again. Only faster. Fear wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. You didn't react. You assessed. You didn't express. You executed. Men who tried to overpower fear with bravado made noise. Men who survived made decisions quietly. Bronson noticed the difference. And his body learned it. Before his mind ever named it. By the time the war ended, his nervous system had already recalibrated itself. Danger had a higher threshold now. Noise had lost its authority. When he stepped into civilian life again, people expected relief. They expected release. What they got instead was control. Hollywood would later mistake that control for coldness, for attitude, for resistance. But the truth was simpler. Bronson didn't react. Because reaction had once been expensive. He didn't explain himself. Because explanation had never saved anyone. He didn't rush. Because rushing had always carried consequences. And that is where unmoved truly begins. Not as a pose. Not as an image. But as a system. A system built to keep a man functional. When the world around him loses structure. When people first encountered Bronson, they often described him with the wrong words. Cold. Distant. Unapproachable. Those descriptions say more about the observer than the man himself. Because Bronson wasn't emotionally absent. He was emotionally regulated. There is a difference most people never learn to recognize. Emotional absence is emptiness. Regulation is containment. Bronson contained everything. That containment began long before he ever understood it consciously. A nervous system does not ask permission to adapt. It simply does. When danger becomes familiar, the body stops reacting to it dramatically. Heart rate steadies. Breathing slows. Awareness sharpens. What looks like calm from the outside is often the result of repeated exposure to instability. Bronson's stillness wasn't a choice he made later in life. It was a default state his body returned to. Because it had learned that this was the safest operating mode. That's why sudden noise didn't startle him. Why raised voices didn't pull him in. Why urgency rarely moved him. His threshold was different. Most people live with a low tolerance for uncertainty. They rush to resolve it. They speak to reduce tension. They explain to regain control. Bronson had lived in uncertainty long enough to know that resolution is often an illusion. So he didn't chase it. This created friction. Especially in social environments built on emotional exchange. People expect feedback. They expect affirmation. They expect visible reaction. Bronson rarely gave those signals. Not because he didn't feel them, but because displaying them had never served him. In his early years, showing fear didn't reduce danger. It increased it. Showing emotion didn't invite help. It distracted from the task. Those lessons don't disappear just because the setting changes. They migrate. Hollywood expected performance even off camera. Bronson didn't perform. He showed up the same way everywhere. That consistency unsettled people. They couldn't read him quickly. They couldn't predict his reactions. They couldn't manage him through emotion. So they filled the gap with interpretation. He's angry. He's difficult. He thinks he's better than us. None of those were true. But they were convenient. Because if someone is cold by choice, you can dismiss them. If someone is regulated by necessity, you have to confront your own instability. Bronson never corrected the narrative. That wasn't indifference. It was efficiency. Explaining yourself invites debate. Debate invites erosion. He had learned that once you begin adjusting your internal system to accommodate external misunderstanding, you lose the very thing that keeps you stable. So he let people misunderstand him. That decision had consequences. Opportunities narrowed. Relationships thinned. But what remained was clean. He worked with fewer people, but with clearer expectations. Those who stayed learned to read subtler cues. A pause instead of a smile. A look instead of a speech. Presence instead of reassurance. That kind of communication is rare. It requires patience from both sides. Most people don't have it. Bronson accepted that. He didn't interpret distance as failure. He saw it as filtration. Life had taught him that not everyone belongs close. Proximity is not always a virtue. Sometimes it's a liability. That belief hardened with time. Not into bitterness. Into precision. He became selective about where he placed his energy. Not because he was guarding it selfishly, but because energy, once depleted, is difficult to restore. He had spent years operating in environments where depletion meant collapse. He wasn't interested in repeating that cycle in a different costume. That's why praise never inflated him. And criticism never destabilized him. Both were noise. Both came from the same place. People reacting. He no longer lived there. Stillness had moved from habit to principle. Not as a moral stance. As a maintenance strategy. Because once you build a system that keeps you functional, you don't abandon it for comfort. You protect it. Even if that protection looks like distance. Even if it costs you warmth. Because warmth fades. Stability holds. When people say Bronson was hard to reach, they often imagine a wall. Something deliberate. Something defensive. That image is wrong. Walls are built to keep things out. Bronson didn't build a wall. He removed doors. Doors imply invitation. Choice. Back and forth. Bronson had learned that not everything deserves entry. That lesson didn't come from theory. It came from repetition. From watching how easily chaos enters when boundaries are unclear. From seeing how quickly pressure multiplies when emotion spreads unchecked. In the environments that shaped him, clarity mattered more than comfort. You didn't ask how someone felt. You asked if they could function. You didn't look for warmth. You looked for reliability. Those priorities don't disappear just because life becomes safer. They stay embedded. That's why Bronson didn't soften with age. Age didn't make him rigid. It made him more selective. He learned that availability is not generosity. That access is not intimacy. Most people confuse proximity with connection. Bronson never did. He measured connection by consistency. By who remained steady when nothing demanded it. That standard eliminated most people quickly. Not out of judgment. Out of incompatibility. People who thrived on emotional exchange found him lacking. People who needed reassurance found him distant. But those who valued stability understood him immediately. They didn't need him to speak often. They trusted the silence. That trust is rare. And rare things take time to find each other. Bronson didn't rush that process. He had learned long ago that rushing is usually a response to fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being left behind. He had lived through versions of all three. They no longer dictated his behavior. This is why attempts to provoke him failed. Anger didn't move him. Praise didn't inflate him. Both were reactions. And reaction had never been his operating mode. He stayed where he was. Grounded. People projected meaning onto that stillness. Some saw threat. Some saw confidence. Some saw emptiness. Bronson corrected none of them. Because projection reveals more about the observer than the object. He didn't need to be seen accurately by everyone. He needed to remain intact. That priority shaped everything. The roles he accepted. The people he allowed close. The distance he maintained. It wasn't loneliness he feared. It was disintegration. Losing coherence. Becoming reactive. Letting the external world reorganize his internal one. He had seen what that cost. He wasn't interested in paying it again. So he stayed unmoved. Not as an act of defiance. As an act of preservation. What made Bronson difficult to understand was not what he did. It was what he didn't need. Most people navigate life by seeking feedback. They look for confirmation in faces. In voices. In reactions. They adjust themselves constantly. Sometimes without realizing it. Bronson didn't. Not because he was immune to doubt. But because he had learned to locate certainty internally. That ability is rare. And it usually comes from environments where external reassurance is unavailable. When you grow up in places where help doesn't arrive on time, you stop waiting for it. You build your own reference point. Bronson did that early. He learned to trust systems, not moods. Processes, not promises. That's why unpredictability didn't excite him. And why emotional volatility didn't impress him. To him, volatility signaled risk. Not passion. This is where people misread his restraint as lack of depth. In reality, it was depth without display. He felt things fully. He simply didn't leak them. Leaking emotion had once cost people their lives. He had watched it happen. So he contained. Containment is invisible work. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't receive applause. It just holds. Over time, that holding creates mass. Presence gains weight. People feel it without understanding why. That's what audiences responded to. Not aggression. Not dominance. Gravity. Bronson didn't need to convince anyone he was serious. Seriousness radiated from him. Because nothing in him was reaching outward for validation. That kind of presence changes dynamics quietly. Rooms recalibrate. Conversations slow. People become more deliberate. Not because he demands it. Because his stillness sets a different tempo. This is why attempts to speed him up failed. Deadlines didn't pressure him. Expectations didn't rush him. He operated on necessity, not urgency. Urgency is emotional. Necessity is structural. Bronson had learned the difference in places where urgency got people hurt. So he ignored it. That choice made him incompatible with systems built on constant reaction. But it also made him reliable. When pressure rose, he didn't. That reliability was mistaken for coldness. But coldness avoids engagement. Bronson didn't avoid engagement. He avoided waste. Waste of movement. Waste of emotion. Waste of attention. Everything he did served a function. Even silence. Especially silence. This is why, when people tried to break him emotionally, nothing happened. There was nothing to break. The structure was sound. Flexible where it needed to be. Rigid where it mattered. That balance doesn't come from confidence. It comes from survival. From learning, early and often. That chaos doesn't care how loudly you feel. It only responds to what you do. And Bronson had already learned to do very little. But exactly enough. There is something people rarely consider. When they talk about men like Bronson, they assume stillness is a refusal to engage. But in reality, stillness is often the result of having already engaged too deeply. When you have lived in environments where engagement had irreversible consequences, you learn to measure involvement differently. Bronson didn't withdraw from the world. He simply stopped over-participating in it. He understood that not every moment requires investment. Not every conversation deserves weight. Not every conflict needs a response. This discernment made him appear indifferent. But indifference is passive. Bronson was anything but passive. He was attentive. He noticed patterns quickly. Who escalated first? Who sought reassurance? Who confused emotion with importance? These observations didn't make him judgmental. They made him economical. He conserved attention the way others conserve money. Because attention, once spent poorly, is difficult to recover. This economy extended into every area of his life. Work. Relationships. Daily interactions. He chose environments that allowed slowness. People who didn't demand constant emotional output. Situations where consistency mattered more than display. That narrowed his options significantly. But it also removed noise. What remained felt heavier. More deliberate. Bronson wasn't interested in being everywhere. He was interested in being whole. That distinction is subtle. But it changes everything. Most people fracture themselves trying to be accessible. They adapt tone, posture, identity, depending on who is in front of them. Bronson didn't adapt. Not because he lacked social skill, but because adaptation had once been dangerous. In environments where he learned to survive, changing yourself to please others meant losing track of what mattered. So he stayed consistent. That consistency created friction. People expect mirrors. They expect emotional reciprocity. Bronson offered steadiness instead. For some, that felt grounding. For others, threatening. Because steadiness exposes volatility. When someone refuses to react, your own reactions become louder. People felt that around him. They felt seen in ways they didn't ask for. That discomfort fueled the myths. That he was angry. That he was unapproachable. That he didn't care. None of it was true. But correcting those assumptions would have required performance. And performance, outside of work, had never interested him. He understood something fundamental. If you teach people how to treat you by constantly adjusting yourself, you will never stop adjusting. So he didn't. He accepted misunderstanding as a cost. A manageable one. Compared to the cost of losing coherence. It was small. That is why he never softened. Even when it would have made life easier. Ease had never been his metric. Function was. And function requires structure. Structure requires limits. Bronson respected limits. Even when others didn't. That respect gave his life shape. Not expansive. But solid. At some point, immovability stops being a response. And becomes a boundary. Bronson crossed that point without ceremony. There was no moment where he decided to be this way forever. It happened gradually. As all irreversible things do. The system that had kept him functional had proven itself too many times. It had worked underground. It had worked in war. It had worked in chaos. Abandoning it would not have been courage. It would have been negligence. People often believe growth means change. Bronson understood something more precise. Growth means refinement. Knowing what to remove. Without damaging what remains. He had removed excess reaction. Excess expression. Excess negotiation. What remained was not emptiness. It was alignment. His internal pace matched his external life. No constant correction. No emotional debt. No split between who he was and who he presented to be. That coherence mattered more to him than comfort. More than approval. More than connection built on performance. It came with a price. A narrower world. Fewer people. Longer silences. But it also came with something rare. Stability. Not the kind that depends on circumstances. The kind that survives them. Bronson didn't need to explain himself. Because explanation would not have changed what shaped him. He didn't soften. Because softness would not have protected him where it mattered most. He didn't return. Because there was nowhere safer to return to. Unmoved was never defiance. It was memory. Memory of what it takes to remain intact. When systems fail. When people panic. When structure collapses. Once you learn that lesson deeply enough, you don't unlearn it. You carry it forward. Quietly. Consistently. And others feel it. Not as threat. Not as coldness. As gravity. A presence that does not chase. Does not react. Does not bend. To be understood. Bronson was not unmoved. Because nothing touched him. He was unmoved. Because too much once had. And he refused to let it happen again. That is why he stayed. That is why he never went back. That is why, even now, his presence feels solid. Unmoved.